He came to Alder Bay to disappear, a former Navy SEAL trying to leave behind the echoes of gunfire and the ghosts that clung to every quiet night. But fate doesn't care about the walls a man builds. On a storm-torn coast beneath a moon split like broken glass, he found a bleeding trail carved into the mud, and a woman fighting for her last breath. A detective, bound, beaten, abandoned for the tide, with her loyal K9 struggling to shield her from the cold. A warning carved into plastic promised death for anyone who dared intervene. And yet, in that moment, the man who sought peace stepped back into a war he never asked for. Before we begin, tell us where you're watching from. And if this story reaches your heart, please subscribe for more stories of courage, faith, and the miracles that still find us in the dark. The winter wind pressed hard over Alder Bay, carrying mist and salt across the dark cliffs. Rowan Cade drove the narrow coastal road with the practiced steadiness of a man who no longer trusted quiet nights. At 38, Rowan carried the carved edges of a life shaped by battle. An angular jaw shadowed by coarse stubble, dark brows drawn low as if expecting danger, even from the road's gentle curves. His tall, lean frame had once moved with military precision, but now it bore the subtle stiffness of old wounds, wounds earned during a rescue mission gone wrong in the Gulf, where the screams of lost teammates still haunted his sleep. After leaving the Navy SEALs, he had chosen Alder Bay, a small Oregon fishing town with weather-beaten boats, cedar forests, and wind-bent roofs, to escape the echo of gunfire, a place where the only explosions should have been the crashing waves against the rocks. He believed solitude might dull the ghosts, but the truth was harsher. Silence only made them louder. Rain hammered the windshield like thrown gravel, the storm turning the world into streaks of gray. As Rowan rounded a bend, something burst out of the darkness. A German shepherd, full-grown, perhaps 4 or 5 years old, with a sable coat plastered to its ribs and one hind leg dragging unevenly. Its bright amber eyes shone with a terror that felt too human. Rowan slammed the brakes. The tires skidded on wet asphalt, the truck fishtailing before stopping inches from the animal. The dog did not bark. It simply stared through the downpour as if pleading. Then it turned, limping urgently back toward the cliffs. Rowan's fingers tightened around the steering wheel. That old instinct, buried, unwanted but never truly gone, flared awake in his chest. The instinct that said, "Someone needs help. Move." He pulled onto the shoulder and stepped out into the storm. The rain stung his face, cold needles sliding down the collar of his jacket. He grabbed a flashlight from the truck and followed the paw prints, now soft craters filling rapidly with muddy water. The German shepherd paused ahead of him, glancing back to ensure he followed, then pushed through a broken fence and down toward a drainage gully carved into the cliffside. The wind roared louder there, funneled by the rock walls. The flashlight beam jittered with every gust until it caught something pale in the mud. Skin. Rowan's breath hitched. He rushed forward. A woman lay half submerged in the freezing muck, her wrists bound tight behind her with plastic zip ties that bit deep into her skin. Her long, dark hair, soaked and tangled, clung to her cheeks. She wore tactical cargo pants and a black uniform shirt torn at the shoulder. Mud streaked her face, but even beneath it, Rowan could see she was young, early 30s maybe, her features sharp, resilient, carved with the strain of someone who had fought until her strength failed. She wasn't dead, not yet, but her breaths were thin, uneven, nearly swallowed by the storm. The German shepherd, the same one from the road, positioned himself protectively against her side. Despite his limp, despite the gash along his flank, he pressed close as if trying to warm her with what little heat he had left. When Rowan approached, the dog let out a low, exhausted growl, not threatening, not warning, just a desperate plea to be careful. "I'm not here to hurt her," Rowan murmured, lowering his flashlight. His voice, usually coarse from disuse, softened as he crouched. "Easy, buddy." The dog's growl faded. It blinked slowly, trusting him, Perhaps because there was no one else left to trust. Rowan checked the woman's pulse, weak but present. Her lips were blue, fingers stiffening from the cold. Hypothermia was already closing in. She didn't have long. As he shifted to lift her, something glinted on the concrete wall above them. A small piece of plastic, like a cut section from a shipping container tag, had been hammered into the wall with a survival knife. He pulled it free. Bold black letters were scrawled across it, the ink running but still legible. "Anyone who meddles with our waters will be swallowed by the sea." Rowan stared at the message. A chill crept down his spine deeper than the cold rain. Someone had meant for her to die here, slowly, silently, erased by the tide. And they expected no one to find her. He slid the knife into his belt and lifted the woman into his arms. She felt light, frighteningly so, the weight of someone who had fought until she had nothing left. The dog stayed pressed to Rowan's side, limping but determined, eyes fixed on the woman's face. He climbed the muddy incline carefully, boots slipping, but the urgency inside him driving each step. As he reached the road, he opened the passenger door and laid her gently across the seat, then wrapped his emergency blanket around her. The German shepherd jumped in after her despite the pain in his leg, positioning himself like a guardian at her knees. Rowan closed the door, his chest tight. He didn't know who she was, who had left her for dead, or why a message pinned with a knife felt like a declaration of war, but he knew one thing with absolute clarity. He was involved now, whether he wanted to be or not. Later he would learn her name, Delphine Marsh, a Harbor County detective working undercover, but on that storm-drenched road, all he knew was that he had found a woman who had been meant to die, and a dog who refused to let her. And Rowan Cade, a man who had come to Alder Bay to outrun violence, had just stepped straight back into its shadow. By the time Rowan reached the cabin, a weather-worn cedar structure perched on the cliff's edge, the storm had grown teeth. The Pacific wind battered the shutters, and rain blew sideways like needles flung from the darkness. Inside, the dim light of a single lantern washed over rough wooden walls, casting long shadows that made the room feel smaller, tenser, as if the cabin itself were holding its breath. Rowan laid Delphine Marsh on the worn leather cot by the fireplace. Her soaked tactical shirt clung to her thin frame, revealing bruises blooming like dark petals across her ribs. Her olive-toned skin had faded to alarming pallor, and her lips trembled as she fought for breath. Despite the cold, her expression, a blend of fierce will and bone-deep exhaustion, revealed a woman who had not surrendered easily. Rook, the German shepherd, 4 or 5 years old, and built with the solid, muscular lines characteristic of working dogs, limped anxiously at Rowan's heels. His flank still oozed from the bullet graze Rowan had hastily bandaged in the truck. His amber eyes never left Delphine, grief and loyalty mingling in a way only animals seem able to wear without shame. Rowan worked quickly. The years he'd spent as a SEAL medic were carved into his hands like instinct, guiding him as he peeled back Delphine's wet clothing, wrapped her in dry wool blankets, and arranged a metal basin of warm water by the fire. He checked her pulse, weak but present, and forced himself not to think of the bodies he'd once checked that never stirred again. He whispered, "Stay with me," though he had no idea if she could hear. Rook let out a soft whine and lowered his head against her legs. The moment held for a fragile heartbeat, until a violent pounding erupted at the cabin door. Rowan spun, shotgun in hand, muscles coiled. No one should have been able to reach this cabin in weather like this. No one should even know where it was. "Rowan! Open up! It's me!" The voice, muffled but unmistakably female, cut through the storm's howl. Rowan exhaled but didn't lower the shotgun until he slid the heavy bolt aside and cracked the door open. Standing on the porch was Ivorine Klein, Alder Bay's coastal ranger. She was in her late 20s, tall and wiry, with freckles across her windburned cheeks and copper hair braided tight against the rain. Her sea-green eyes always looked mildly annoyed, as if nature itself had failed to meet her expectations. She carried herself like someone accustomed to moving through the wilderness alone, self-sufficient, unshakable, and stubborn in ways Rowan had always respected. Tonight, though, her waterproof jacket was drenched, her breath ragged as she hauled a heavy veterinary medical kit over one shoulder. She stepped inside before he finished opening the door, dripping seawater and determination. "I saw your truck on the ridge," she said, voice crisp despite the cold. "Figured something was wrong. You never leave during a storm." Her eyes swept the room. Delphine on the cot, Rowan crouched beside her, Rook guarding them both, and her expression shifted from ranger opacity to sharp concern. "Who is she? And what the hell happened to the dog?" Rowan didn't answer immediately. Instead, he gestured to Rook's wound. That was advice he didn't need to voice. Dog first. Ivorine knelt beside Rook, her movements swift and sure, revealing someone who had patched up more than a few injured creatures dragged in by desperate fishermen. "Easy, big guy," she murmured, her tone gentler than Rowan ever heard her use on humans. As she cleaned the grays, applying antiseptic and a stiff-smelling herbal salve she carried in a small tin, Rowan explained what he had found. Not every detail, just enough to make sense of the storm-soaked tableau. Delphine stirred, a tremor running through her as consciousness clawed its way back. Her eyes fluttered open, dark, sharp, and filled with the flicker of a memory she wished she could outrun. She tried to push herself upright, but Rowan pressed a steadying hand to her shoulder. "You're safe," he said, though he wasn't sure it was true. Delphine's voice was raw, her throat thick with cold and fear and fury. "No, we're not." Ivorine paused mid-bandage, brows knitting. Why was she out there trussed up like a crab trap? Delphine swallowed hard, forcing words past chattering teeth. "I'm Detective Delphine Marsh, Harbor County Police." Rowan and Ivorine exchanged looks, surprise, suspicion, and a creeping dread. Delphine continued, each sentence pulled from a well of exhaustion, so deep it seemed endless. "I've been undercover 9 months. Something big, something worse than the fentanyl shipments the department talked about. A smuggling ring, tied serpents. They use our fishing routes, our abandoned shipyards, move weapons and chemicals through the old storm drains that feed into the bay." Rowan's jaw clenched. Alder Bay had always felt too quiet, too peaceful. It made sense now, the late-night boats with no lights, the rusted trucks Rowan had noticed but dismissed. Delphine's breath hitched. Someone tipped them off, someone inside the department. Rowan felt the air shift. He knew betrayal when he heard it. Delphine's eyes darkened as she whispered the name like a curse she wished she didn't believe. Lieutenant Garrison Pike. Rowan didn't know the man, but the way Delphine said his name with a mix of disbelief, injury, and a grief deeper than physical pain told him Pike had been more than a superior. He had been trusted, maybe even admired. Ivorine shook her head. "Pike? I've met him. Square jaw, tall, hair always combed like he lives in a recruitment poster. Seems too smug to be useful, but dirty." Delphine's silence was answer enough. Rowan absorbed it all slowly, letting the pieces settle. "They left you to die," he said quietly. Delphine nodded, tears mixing with storm water drying on her cheeks. "They shot Rook first, thought he was dead. Then they beat me, dragged me out to the cliffs, and left us for the tide." The German shepherd leaned closer to her, letting out a faint rumble in his chest, as if remembering every second. Rowan stared into the fire. He had come here to avoid war, to bury the soldier he used to be. But war had come anyway, riding on the back of a wounded dog and a dying detective. And now, like it or not, Rowan was part of it. Outside, the storm battered the cliffs. Inside, 3 unlikely survivors sat around a single fire, their fates now tied to secrets hidden beneath Alder Bay's dark waters. It was no longer a question of whether Rowan would act. The only question left was how far the tide would pull them before dawn. Morning rose slowly over Alder Bay. The storm spent but not forgotten. The sky carried the heavy bruise-colored weight of clouds drifting low over the sea, and the world outside Rowan's cabin glistened with the damp sheen of retreating rain. The air smelled of wet cedar and cold stone, an uneasy stillness after a night that had nearly taken 3 lives. Rowan Cade stepped outside first, his tall, angular frame tense beneath his jacket. The moisture in the air clung to the short stubble along his jaw, and the dark circles beneath his eyes showed the cost of a night spent awake, listening for more danger. His posture was the same controlled readiness he had carried through war zones, never fully relaxed, never entirely safe. Delphine Marsh followed slowly, her temporary arm sling securing her injured shoulder. She moved cautiously, her olive skin still pale from blood loss and cold, her dark hair loosely tied back. Yet her eyes, sharp, investigative, refusing to yield, held a clarity that had been absent the night before. The storm had nearly killed her, but waking had brought back the detective inside her. Ivorine Klein brought up the rear, the coastal ranger's copper braid damp at the ends, freckles more pronounced in the gray morning light. She walked with purposeful strides, scanning the roadside as if nature itself whispered clues to her. Rook, still limping slightly from the bullet graze, trotted ahead on instinctual alert. His wet sable coat clung to his muscular frame, but his amber eyes were focused, nose sweeping low over the slick ground. He wasn't merely sniffing, he was tracking with unwavering resolve, driven by duty and something deeper, something personal. They arrived at the scene along the coastal road where Rowan had first seen the dog, an exposed curve overlooking crashing waves far below. Seaweed, driftwood, and shredded bark lay scattered along the gravel shoulder, carried inland by the storm. Rook froze at the edge of the guardrail, nose digging into the muddy roots of a clump of grass. The others approached slowly. Rowan crouched, brushing aside wet soil. A glint of brass appeared. "A 9mm casing," Rowan said quietly. Delphine leaned closer, careful of her arm. "Tide serpents use 9mm sidearms. I've seen them." Rook pushed further, sniffing along the metal rail, then veered sharply toward a tangle of storm-thrown debris caught between 2 rocks. Ivorine pulled on gloves and reached in, retrieving a strip of something black and stiff. Industrial tape, the kind used on shipping crates. Delphine exhaled shakily. "They were moving product that night. Someone didn't want me returning with proof." Rook wasn't done. He dug at a piece of half-buried tarp, stained with a sour chemical smell. Rowan recognized it instantly. He had smelled similar compounds used to clean weapons in the field. "That's a precursor chemical," Delphine said, voice tightening. "They're processing it in Alder Bay." The implication hung in the cold air. The coastal town had become a hidden artery for trafficking. On the hike back up the ridge, Rook remained restless. His limp worsened slightly, but he didn't slow. By the time they reached the cabin, the dog abruptly halted near the wooden tool shed behind the house. He lowered his head, growling, not the warning growl from last night, but something more curious, instinctual. "Something's off," Rowan murmured. Rook circled the shed twice before digging furiously beside the largest pine tree. Rowan knelt to help, sweeping aside wet needles and soil until his knuckles struck metal. A small fishing tackle box wrapped completely in waterproof plastic. Rowan pried it open. Inside were several SIM cards, a mud-stained USB drive, and a folded sheet of paper covered in smudged numbers. Container IDs, port codes, transfer timestamps. Delphine's breath caught. This is intel. God, someone hid it here." "I don't recognize the case," Rowan said. "I do," Delphine whispered. "It's the same brand the serpents use for temporary comm drops." Inside the cabin, Rowan powered up his rugged military laptop. Ancient but secure. Delphine inserted the USB drive with trembling fingers. Lines of data filled the screen. Patrol reroutes, shipping logs, boat movements through Alder Bay, emergency override codes for law enforcement patrol paths. At the bottom of each log entry, a digital signature flickered. Lieutenant G. Pike Delphine stared in silence. The truth was undeniable. This wasn't rumor. This was betrayal written in official timestamps. Before she could speak, the cabin shivered as wind pushed against its walls again. Evening had descended faster than expected, and with it came the return of the restless storm. Rowan moved to reinforce the cabin. He hammered boards across loose shutters, checked the generator, then began stringing thin monofilament lines across the clearing, makeshift alarm traps, each line tied to clusters of empty tin cans that would rattle at the slightest touch. Yveraine watched him, nodding with professional approval. Smart. Anyone approaching through the trees won't get close without making noise. Delphine sat by the fire, scrolling through the data, her jaw clenched. Pike redirected every patrol that could have intercepted the serpents. Months of it. He wasn't just covering for them. He was coordinating. Rook padded to the back of the cabin, nose high. He sniffed the air, then stiffened, growling deep and low. Rowan tensed immediately. What is it, boy? Rook's tail lowered, ears pinned forward, body alert. He approached the tool shed again, this time with caution. Rowan motioned Delphine and Yveraine back, stepping toward the shed with a flashlight and knife. He opened the creaking door. The scent hit him first. Sharp, oily, unmistakably gasoline. What the hell? Rowan muttered. Under the shed's floorboards, barely concealed, lay 3 large fuel canisters connected to a crude ignition rig wired to the shed door. A cheap but deadly setup. Yveraine inhaled sharply. Someone meant to burn the cabin down. And time to go off when we opened the shed, Rowan added, his voice cold. Delphine swallowed hard. Pike knows I'm missing. He'll assume I'm hiding somewhere remote. He might even know Rowan lives off-grid. Rook stepped closer, sniffing one of the wires, his amber eyes bright with troubled intelligence. He had warned them twice now, first about the cliff, now the shed. Rowan crouched beside the dog, placing a steady hand on his neck. You saved our lives again. Outside, the sky rumbled and rain returned in a slow, steady drizzle. Inside the cabin, the 3 humans and 1 battered dog stood united by the truth they had uncovered. Alder Bay was compromised. Lieutenant Pike was the rot inside the system. And someone had already tried twice to silence them. They weren't safe, not here, not anywhere within Pike's reach. But Rowan Cade had stopped running years ago, and the storm outside was no longer the one he feared. Night returned to Alder Bay with a deceptive calm, the kind that lingered before a storm or a confession. Though the earlier rain had thinned into a soft mist, the air still tasted of danger, briny, metallic, and waiting. Rowan Cade stood at the cabin window, his tall frame rigid, jaw set beneath the coarse stubble along his cheeks. He watched the line of pines sway in the dim moonlight, every shadow twitching like a potential threat. Inside, the cabin's fire crackled low, casting a warm glow over Delphine Marsh. Her injured arm remained secured in a sling, the bruises along her ribs and jaw darker now, but her gaze sharper than ever. She sat at the wooden table, flipping through handwritten port codes taken from the tackle box Rook had uncovered. The dim light reflected in her tired, determined eyes shaped by betrayal, endurance, and 9 months of undercover work that had nearly cost her life. Yveraine Klein was by the door, checking the knot on the rope that held a cluster of metal cans. The Coastal Ranger's copper braid clung damply to her back, freckles stark under the lamplight. She moved with restless efficiency, someone who dealt with danger by facing it head-on, shaping order from chaos. Rico Vale, the captured serpent, sat tied to a heavy chair near the cabin's center beam. His wiry frame and angular face gave him the look of a man sharpened by rough living. His facial hair was patchy, the dark stubble contrasting with his pale, rain-beaten skin. He had the haunted expression of someone accustomed to violence but unfamiliar with being on the losing side. His brown eyes flickered with bitterness and fear, especially when Delphine looked at him. Rowan kept the shotgun within reach as he faced Rico. The former SEAL's presence alone seemed to compress the air around them. There was no overt threat in Rowan's posture, just something colder, something forged in combat. Rico felt it and swallowed hard every time Rowan took a step. "You know why you're alive right now," Rowan said evenly. Rico shifted but said nothing. Delphine stood, her voice low, controlled. "Lieutenant Pike won't protect you, not after this mess. When the DEA gets here, he will burn whoever he has to in order to save himself." The name Pike shattered whatever composure Rico still clung to. His jaw twitched. His fingers trembled against the rope. Delphine leaned closer, her dark hair falling over one shoulder. "Think carefully. You tell us what's coming, and maybe you walk out of this with cuffs instead of a body bag." After a long silence and a full minute of trembling resolve, Rico finally spoke. "Morrow," he muttered. "He's the one in charge, not Pike. Pike's just a face, a badge. Morrow runs everything. The guns, the chemicals, all of it." Ivorine's brows rose. "The Morrow from the shipyard?" Rico nodded. "He uses the Alder Bay shipyard as the main staging area. There's a big shipment coming in 2 nights. Nothing small. Enough precursor to supply half the coast." Rowan exchanged a look with Delphine, grim understanding passing silently between them. That was when Delphine made the decision. She asked Rowan for his satellite phone, her fingers steady despite exhaustion. "I'm calling my brother." Corbett Marsh, a DEA agent with Delphine's same sharp jawline and hardened eyes, answered before the second ring. His voice, deep, clipped, and tense, filled the cabin. Delphine had always described her older brother as someone shaped by responsibility too early, forced into adulthood the day their father walked out. Years of chasing traffickers had carved lines into his forehead and a cautious edge into his tone. When Delphine explained what had happened, Corbett didn't waste a breath. "I'll bring a small team, quiet, no one local. If Pike is dirty, he'll have the whole department compromised." She read off coordinates. Rowan watched her, the fatigue in her limbs, the fire in her voice, and felt an ache deep in his chest, an old protective instinct returning. After the call, the cabin grew still. The rain tapped lightly on the windows. Rowan began outlining the problem. "Morrow can't suspect the law's coming. If we approach the shipyard, he'll scatter. We need him to walk into our kill box." Delphine nodded. "We use one of their burner sims. Send a tip. Make it look like a rival gang plans to hijack his shipment." Ivorine smirked. "Push him into the spot we choose." "Exactly," Rowan said, his voice low. "The old breakwater by the abandoned lighthouse. One way in, one way out. High ground on both sides. It's perfect." Delphine typed the message on a burner phone taken from the tackle box, mimicking the clipped slang she had heard serpent runners use. As she hit send, her pulse quickened, not with fear, but with purpose. This was the kind of move she had trained for. With the plan in motion, there was one more task. Rook. The dog paced the room, limping worse than before. His injury had been treated, but not healed. Ivorine knelt beside him, her sea-green eyes softening. "He needs proper stitches and antibiotics, not cabin remedies." Delphine hesitated, torn. "I can't lose him again." "You won't," Ivorine said firmly. "There's someone who can help." That someone lived far from Alder Bay, on a rocky islet reachable only by a narrow strip of sand at low tide or by skiff at night. Dr. Halden Royce, a retired veterinarian in his 70s, had a reputation among coastal rangers. A tall, wiry man with steel-gray hair, sun-cracked skin, and eyes the color of old coins. He trusted animals far more than he trusted government agencies. Years ago, an FBI mishandling of a wildlife trafficking case had cost him a beloved rescue wolf dog. Since then, Halden lived alone with 6 barn cats and a stubborn moral code. Ivorine prepared her skiff. Rook climbed aboard with a tired but obedient posture. Delphine stood at the dock, her hand resting on the dog's head. "Be brave," she whispered. Rook licked her wrist once before settling down. As the skiff cut across the dark water, Rowan stood watching until Ivorine's lantern disappeared behind the mist. Back at the cabin, the 3 of them, Rowan, Delphine, and their bound prisoner, waited while the cold breath of early spring threaded in through cracks in the shutters. 2 nights. That was all the time they had to prepare a trap strong enough to take down a kingpin, a corrupt lieutenant, and a crew of armed traffickers. Outside, Alder Bay's sky remained the color of tarnished silver. Inside, Rowan felt the shift. The war he had once left behind had found him again, and this time he wouldn't be running from it. The sea was calm in a way that made Rowan Cade uneasy, flat, cold, and gleaming under the fractured moon like a blade waiting to be drawn. Alder Bay's old breakwater stretched into the water like a stone spine, ending at an abandoned lighthouse whose red paint had long peeled away. Mist rolled low across the rocks, thick as smoke and just as misleading, swallowing sound and light in equal measure. Rowan lay prone across the lighthouse's weather-beaten roof, the surface cold beneath his chest. His rifle, a matte black suppressed bolt action he had kept from his service days, was steady against the crook of his shoulder. Through the faint green glow of his night vision optic, he saw the breakwater like a narrow battlefield. The former SEAL's breath was controlled, the rise and fall barely noticeable beneath his broad, scar-marked frame. The wind combed through his dark hair, shorter now after he trimmed it 2 nights prior to clear his vision. Another war had found him, and the discipline returned as naturally as breathing. Below, Delphine Marsh crouched behind a stack of seawall barriers beside her brother, Corbett Marsh. Delphine's sling-bound arm pressed against her ribcage every time she inhaled too sharply, but her eyes, stormy, focused, betrayed no hesitation. Her bruises had faded to sickly yellows and violets along her jaw and temple, but they made her look even more determined. Months living as someone else had carved a hardness in her expression that was only softened when she glanced toward the sea. Corbett, taller and broader in the shoulders than Delphine, moved with a different kind of weariness, an exhaustion earned from years of chasing ghosts through cartel warehouses and border safe houses. He bore days-old dark stubble that shadowed his angular jawline and the faintest streaks of gray in his close-cropped black hair. Unlike Rowan's quiet intensity, Corbett's presence was sharp, analytic, honed through briefings and close calls. 4 DEA agents flanked him, dressed in dark tactical gear. None spoke. They didn't need to. A low rumble trembled through the breakwater, headlights, dim, shielded, cut through the fog. 2 unmarked trucks crawled up the narrow stone path like predators claiming familiar ground. Their engines idled down and 11 men stepped out, silhouettes armed with rifles and duffel bags. Rowan shifted slightly, adjusting his aim. Each movement was deliberate, ghost quiet. Among the men was Morrow. Rowan recognized him instantly from Rico Vale's description, tall but gaunt, with the kind of sharp, bony face that suggested hunger, for money, for power, for control. His salt-flecked black hair was slicked back, highlighting his deep-set eyes, so cold they reflected no light at all. He walked like someone accustomed to obedience, like someone who expected the sea itself to move when he demanded. Beside him stood Lieutenant Garrison Pike. The uniform Pike wore tonight wasn't regulation, just a tactical jacket and cargo pants, but the arrogance clung to him like stench. Gone was the charming, polished officer the town trusted. His mustache was trimmed with military precision, but his eyes, small and restless, darted around as if already checking escape routes. The recent sleeplessness etched into his expression revealed a man unraveling. Then the back doors of the second truck swung open. 3 children, 2 boys and 1 girl, all between 10 and 12, were pushed out. Their faces, pale under the harsh beam of the work lights, held the kind of fear that stuck to ribs for a lifetime. Rowan felt his stomach tighten. Delphine inhaled sharply. Corbett's jaw locked. The kids wore backpacks much too heavy for their slight shoulders. Rowan didn't need Delphine's whisper to confirm what was inside. Precursor chemicals split and hidden in children to keep law enforcement from firing first. It was Morrow's favorite tactic, cruelty disguised as strategy. Corbett nodded to Delphine, and then over a loudspeaker from both ends of the breakwater, his voice boomed, "DEA, put your weapons down. You are surrounded." The effect was instantaneous. Gunfire erupted, muzzle flashes stinging through the fog. The silver sea lit up in split-second bursts of orange. Rowan tracked targets but did not fire. Not yet. Pike acted first by committing the most cowardly act possible. He grabbed the nearest boy, jerking him violently, shoving a pistol against the child's temple. Spittle flew as he screamed, "Back off or he dies!" Delphine felt her pulse turn electric. Pain flared down her injured arm. Everything in her wanted to rush forward, but she held position, breath trembling. Then, a deep bark rolled across the breakwater, carried by the wind like a vow. Delphine's heart lurched. She turned. On the boulders above the seawall stood Ivorine Klein, tall, steady, sea wind whipping her copper braid, as fierce as the cliffs themselves. And beside her, Rook. The German shepherd's coat, once patchy from injury, had grown into a sleek armor of sable and tan. His eyes burned with intelligence and loyalty. His gait was strong again, thanks to Dr. Halden Royce's care. He stood tall, tail straight, ears pricked toward the breakwater. Delphine whisper shouted, voice breaking, "Rook, no!" But Rook had already chosen. He launched himself down the rocky slope, claws sparking against stone. Fog and gunfire swirled around him as he sprinted, threading through bullets with terrifying purpose. He wasn't attacking wildly. His focus was absolute. His target? Pike. The lieutenant turned too late. Rook slammed into him from the side with the full force of an 80-pound trained K9, knocking the gun from Pike's grip. The boy tumbled away, scrambling behind a barrier as Corbett's agents pulled him to safety. That split second was all Rowan needed. The suppressed rifle cracked, a soft, deadly cough, and Pike's weapon flew into the dark. Delphine surged forward with a choked sound that was half cry, half battle shout. Her injured shoulder screamed, but she pushed through the pain, tackling Pike to the slick concrete. The cuffs clicked shut just as a wave burst over the breakwater's edge. Morrow's men faltered. DEA agents closed from both ends. Faced with trained operators and losing their leverage, the Tide Serpents dropped their rifles one by one. The battle for Alder Bay ended not with a shout, but with the quiet clatter of weapons hitting stone. Weeks later, the fog lifted earlier each morning, and Alder Bay breathed easier. At a modest ceremony in Town Hall, Delphine stood straight as her badge was returned to her. The children saved on the breakwater sat in the front row, dressed neatly, smiling in a way that made her throat tighten. Corbett pinned a commendation onto her uniform, while pride softened his stern features. Ivorine received her own recognition when the new Alder Bay Marine and Canine Rescue Center was announced, funded entirely by seized criminal assets. It would be a sanctuary for injured marine animals and retired working dogs who had been cast aside once their usefulness waned. Rowan did not attend the ceremony. He stood on the cliff above the bay, hands in the pockets of his weathered jacket, watching the sea churn softly in the sun. Delphine, Ivorine, and Rook found him there. The dog trotted up proudly, wearing a new collar, navy blue leather with a small silver medallion engraved with a single word, "Survivor." Rowan looked at them, then at the sunlit water spreading below. Delphine apologized softly for dragging him back into violence he had tried to leave behind. He shook his head, eyes on the glowing horizon. "Peace isn't somewhere you run to," he murmured. "It's something you build, and you defend it together." They stood shoulder to shoulder, a soldier, an investigator, a coastal ranger, and a German shepherd who refused to die. And on that cliff above the silver waves, Alder Bay finally felt like a place worth saving. In the quiet that followed the storm, as Alder Bay slowly returned to the rhythm of its tides, one truth shone brighter than the lighthouse that once guarded those waters. Miracles are not always thunderous. Sometimes they arrive in the shape of a silent soldier, a wounded investigator, a steadfast ranger, or a loyal dog who refuses to let darkness win. And above all of them, there was something greater at work. A gentle hand guiding them through fear, through betrayal, through the breaking point of night. Call it fate, call it grace, call it the quiet voice of God whispering, "You are not alone in this fight." Because even in our everyday lives, when the world feels heavy and the path feels uncertain, God sends help in forms we often overlook. A kind stranger, a loyal friend, a moment of courage we didn't know we had, or a burst of strength in the exact second we need it most. Those are miracles too, small but mighty, stitched into the ordinary hours of our days. If this story touched your heart, if it reminded you that goodness still rises even after the darkest storm, share it with someone who needs hope today. Tell us in the comments where you're watching from and what miracle, big or small, God has placed in your life. And if you believe, truly believe, that heroes can appear in the most unexpected places, that loyalty still saves lives, and that God still watches over those who walk through the valley, hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and type Amen in the comments. May God bless you, protect your home, guide your family, and guard every step you take, today, tomorrow, and in every storm you face. Amen.